Hi, this is Friar Tim with a FriarSide chat for Friday, May 22nd. I'm in my office at Newman, having escaped the 3 or 4 days of consistent rain that we've had all week, and I'm ready to build an ark. That said, I'd like to just give some reflections a little bit on our whole experience of COVID and being locked down. I can remember at the beginning of the pandemic when some of our Christian brothers and sisters were broaching the idea that God was punishing us for some perceived sin, some perceived slight, some perceived lack of faithfulness. I personally and thoroughly reject any of these kinds of notions of God being a punishing God or a vengeful God or a nasty or capricious God. I find myself much more fully in line with the great tradition that begins from St. Augustine in the 4th and 5th century. And Augustine was very clear that natural evils, like a virus, like an earthquake, like a storm, God in no way sends them and inflicts them upon us, but rather God permits these things to happen for some greater and wider good. Now, I thoroughly recognize that on an intellectual level, this makes perfect sense. On an emotive level, if I have personally suffered from any of these things, it doesn't particularly help to talk about God permitting these things to happen. But in a logical framework, it does give us a way in which to say, what might we be learning as we gently and tentatively and very, very carefully leave our homes more and more and begin to resume more and more of a normal life, recognizing that the contours of everything have significantly changed. What greater good might God be calling you and I to by permitting this awful worldwide pandemic? What straight line might God be creating from the very crooked lines of this awful experience that the whole world has undergone for several months, and sections of the world will continue to undergo with greater intensity perhaps in the upcoming months? What might we learn? What might be the good that comes of this? The first piece, for us to be aware of any of these kinds of goods, requires us to truly have a discerning enough spirit that we can pay attention to things. Here we go back to the famous revelation of God to the prophet Elijah in the cave, that God did not reveal himself in the great thundering earthquakes, and God did not reveal himself in the great powerful storms, and God did not reveal himself in the great and powerful and awesome things, but God does reveal himself in still, quiet, whispering ways. So that requires, first and foremost, that I be attentive, that I be quiet, that I calm down my inner and outer turmoil enough to be able to be attentive and aware of what God might be speaking to me. So the first level, I think, is as we come out of our homes more and more, is to be aware of what we're feeling. And if we're feeling anxious, to own that. If we're feeling angry, to own that. If we're feeling sad, to own that. If we're feeling glad and relieved, to own that. And most particularly, to not judge any of our feelings as being unworthy or wrong or off base or evil. Because God gives us all of our internal passions to regulate us and to help us. So, for example, if we're still feeling slightly anxious and fearful, we pay attention to that so that we can be a little bit more careful where we are. If we're feeling happy and joyful, we pay attention to that so that we don't let the small little things corrupt that or corrode that or eviscerate that or take the joy out of all of our existence. So that's the first level of what God might be teaching us, is a higher level of awareness. Second good that God might be calling us to is, how has your prayer life, your relationship with God, your lived relationship with Jesus Christ, our risen Lord and Savior, how or has that changed at all during this? With a forced abstinence from Eucharist and with a forced abstinence from the sacrament of reconciliation, how have you prayed? Have you come to some deeper insight of finding Christ in the Scriptures, of finding Christ in imaginative prayer, of finding Christ in contemplative prayer, of finding Christ in devotional prayer, in finding Christ in the daily activities in which you find yourself? All of those things are gifts from God, so that we can truly encounter Jesus, who in this Sunday's gospel promises to be with us until the end of our days. That promise doesn't go away just because I'm in confinement because of COVID-19. So, what new ways have I come to understand and experience God? Conversely, from the other end of it, if my prayer life has been arid, dry, or frankly non-existent, what does that tell me about my level of personal responsibility when I do not have the sacraments or a weekly appointment at Sunday Mass to buoy me up, to keep me floating, to keep me on the straight and narrow? What might this clarion call be for me that I need to take a bit more seriously about my personal relationship with Jesus Christ? Third point, perhaps, something in which we could keep, some way in which God might be bringing some good out of this difficult and trying time in which we've all found ourselves. If you've been sheltered in place with a group of people, your families, more than likely, you may have found that you're spending more quality time with your children, or you're spending more quality time with your spouse, or you're spending more quality time, even if you're living alone, connecting with people via Zoom or via Facebook or via FaceTime or via cell phone or whatever instrument you were using to keep in contact. As we come back to our busyness, can we maintain a certain quality of relationships with those that we love? we all know that when we're busy, when we're active, very commonly, the relationships with people who are closest and nearest and dearest to us suffer. And people cut us lots of slack because they know we're very busy and they know we love them anyway. But having tasted a couple of months of a little bit more intimacy with those we truly love, can we be committed to doing that when the pandemic is over? From the opposite end, if our being in close proximity with the people that we love have caused a lot of friction, have caused a lot of strife, have revealed a lingering sense of resentment, a lingering sense of a lack of forgiveness, a lingering sense of an impatience with one another, and most particularly a negative counting up of one another's faults, having been put in the crucible, what can I do to make that any better? How can I dialogue with those that I love to make the relationship a bit more of quality? Perhaps this means asking professionals for help. Perhaps this means sitting down and having much more honest conversations around where we are. But can some good come out of this particularly negative experience of the pandemic? Finally, on the wider social level, I think we've all become much, much more aware of how interconnected we really are. We as Americans that prize our individualism, that pride our self-reliance, that pride ourselves on our ability to get up by ourselves and keep going no matter what, we're all made very, very much aware that I can't live my life unless somebody delivers food to me. And then somebody in a meat processing plant processes it for me. And that farmers grow it for me. And that transportation and truckers and trains bring it to me, etc., etc., etc. When a virus invisible to the naked eye can affect me because of my contacts with others, and no matter how safe I might be, there's still some level of contact that tells us how deeply interconnected we really are. With that in mind, if we are so deeply interconnected, can we pay some attention and gratitude to all of those people that we now deem as essential workers, whom very often we would have ignored or berated or complained about or reported them to their manager for some minor infraction? Since we are so deeply interconnected, can this be a call to be a little bit more civil, to be a little bit more courteous, to be a little bit more grateful, and frankly, to be a little less demanding, negative, and critical about everything? The final piece, when we pay very close attention that in our American society of today, the COVID virus disproportionately caused much more death and suffering among the poor than among the rich, among people of color than among Caucasians, among the blue-collar working class as opposed to the white-collar professional class. What does this tell us about the inequalities that are still below the surface in 21st century America? And how do we apply the social justice teaching of the church, the ethics teaching of the church, the life teaching of the church, so that it touches more and more people and a society becomes more and more just? Again, God permitted this awful, terrible suffering of a worldwide COVID pandemic so that we might somehow bring forth greater good. Let's not let this moment be wasted. Let's not let these first tentative moments of coming out of our homes and coming out of lockdown, let's not forget all that we perhaps have learned and reflected upon in these days. There's an old political saying that says, never let a crisis be wasted. You can get something out of it. Let's not let this crisis be wasted. Let's cooperate with the good that God continues to put before us to better our life, to better our relationship with God, and to better our relationship with other people. God bless.